Welcome back to our conversation with Max Claps, the research director for IDC's Government Insights. So, Max, we were just talking about how to estimate and manage cost, but another thing that you brought up in the first half of our conversation was the changes in an organization's operating practices that a cloud migration will force them to adopt. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I've had tons of conversation about operating models in the cloud, and that is a big transition for many governments around the globe, right? When they were operating mostly on premise, they had, somebody told me, we had a battery of system engineers, right? Skilled at managing storage, servers, operating systems. They had highly verticalized skills for certain categories of hardware or software, right? The migration to the cloud has reoriented the IT operations, the IT support operating models, as well as the related competencies, right? In the new context, it's less about those system engineers, the domain-specific competencies, is about FinOps, it's about contract management, it's about working strategically with the sourcing partners to select them, and also to push and nudge them to help evolve the technical architecture to get to the target architecture. It's about monitoring and observing their service levels and their costs, and so forth and so on. So it's really a change in terms of the cycles of work, the competencies of work, and the type of skills that are in place.
It really forces an organization to think digital first, right?
It does. It does. And sometimes it's surprising, right? There is this misconception that government is slow and there is always a resistance to change. Maybe at the beginning of a project, right? I've been working with governments for the past 23 years, and I've seen a lot of very talented people, even the ones that have been around for 25, 30 years, and they were those system engineers. In many cases, they have embraced the change as an opportunity, right? I was talking with somebody, in this case, it was a regional government in Europe, was not in the US, but it was interesting. The head of infrastructure transformation was telling me that some of these engineers have really embraced the new role, have seen it as an opportunity, have transformed themselves from somebody that sits in a data center, doesn't talk to anybody, to advisors to the line of business or the mission areas, right? And help the senior executive officers in government that have limited understanding of IT, of what the potential of the cloud and the risks of the cloud are, right? So that transition, it entails maybe finding a champion to put everybody on the right trajectory, giving them opportunities to experiment. Of course, training, but training is only part of that equation, right? It's a cultural and mindset change.
Do you find that there are certain categories of skill sets that agencies really need to bring in to make their cloud transformation fully effective?
Yeah, I would say so. So there are some agencies that may be tempted to go really deep into product knowledge, right? You may try to become the best expert in Microsoft Azure AI Studio or AWS Bedrock or Google Vertex AI in the cloud. But there's actually quite a few people in those companies and their partner system integrator that can help with that. What the government needs to own is really the understanding of their enterprise architecture, the understanding of the costs. So the FinOps angle needs to stay in-house because you're the only one having the incentives to keep every cost under control. It's about owning the sourcing skills. And last but not least, we mentioned it briefly earlier, the security aspect, right? Understanding how to secure the cloud, how to improve the cloud security posture is critical. So FinOps, architecture, and connection with the business needs, sourcing, and security.
That's really helpful. And I'm thinking especially the customer requirements, right? Understanding how to get from what you have to what the customer is really looking for.
Absolutely. That's an aspect of it that is very important. I remember conversations almost 20 years ago, we were talking about customer relationship management in the context of the shared services transformation, right? I remember meeting with Department of Interior or Treasury back in 2008, 2009. And it's not dissimilar, right? You're building that layer of knowledge that creates an interface between the technical architecture and the constantly evolving technical architecture and the needs of the various bureaus and mission areas. That expertise can only exist within the government agency.
So we've been talking a lot about getting onto the cloud and planning for that. But once a cloud migration is in sustainment, what then needs to be at the top of mind for these agencies as they think about the long-term operation?
Yeah, I think there's an element of complexity that needs to be handled, right? We've mentioned earlier in the conversation that a lot of these environments are heterogeneous right now. And there's no sign that they're going to become less heterogeneous over time, right? So I think integration, orchestration, whatever you want to call it, is a very important element. And we could look at it from multiple perspectives, right? There's an element of integration of data and applications running in different environments. There's an element of orchestration, management, and provisioning that comes with multi-cloud and being able from a single control plane to deliver with flexibility and speed and monitor cost and security risks and usage level across all of those environments. And there's also an element of keeping those complex systems open with external environments, right? And I go back to the NASA and EPA data exchange examples that I was mentioning earlier. Those are often systems that are not only for internal usage, but they have interfaces with external stakeholders. Think of NASA. They have a global community of academics and researchers that have to access certain data, right? So if you put some data, if you store some data in AWS or Azure or Google, and you're NASA, you also need to make sure that that data can be presented through their portal or a section of the portal that is relevant and accessible for those researchers around the globe, because that brings back value to NASA itself. So that complexity, integrating all of the components, managing and orchestrating all of the components, it's definitely an area that consumes a lot of time and effort for governments.
It seems like you never finish, that there's always some new technology, there's always some new technique or process that you have to integrate into this cloud structure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just about the cloud. In my journey through public sector technology across the globe, I've mostly experienced new solutions as adding, as being incremental to what already existed. Of course, there are things that can be retired over time, right? We don't use Blackberries anymore, just as an example. But there's always a slow process that comes with sunsetting certain systems, and for good reasons, right? There may be systems that are running well, so there's no reason to sunset them. There may be systems that present risk, so they require a window of time when you're running things into environment for backup and resiliency and so forth and so on. But yeah, most of the time you're adding pieces rather than swapping pieces in a cloud environment.
Well, speaking of adding and speaking of technology advancements, let's talk AI for a minute. When does it make sense for organizations to think about integrating AI into their cloud integration strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no conversation nowadays that goes without having AI, right? And actually, there is no conversation that goes without talking about AI agents, right? Most of the time. So again, also AI is a journey. It's not a new thing, right? Governments have been using AI, machine learning tools as we knew them uh, 10, 15, in some cases 20 years ago, in the context of defense, security, justice, tax compliance, for instance. But definitely Gen AI and now AI agents have created a boom of interest, even at the mission level, right? So there's two implications for the cloud. The most direct implication, of course, is that you can use AI in the context of automating, managing, provisioning, and securing the cloud, right? And AI has been used in automation to dynamically sort workloads, identifying patterns, predicting security risks. And now with Gen AI, you can also look at the code, reverse engineer the code, recommend the next best action to secure and remediate, and so forth and so on. But the bulk of the investment will go into, and potentially the biggest return, right, will go into using AI, Gen AI, and AI agents in mission areas, and to scale those systems in terms of models, in terms of applications, a lot of it will live in the cloud. So they're strictly related.
So, one of our earlier topics was on cost. Is AI a cost? Is it a savings? Is it yes? How do people think about that as they're trying to cost their entire integration strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always think of technology as a lever to improve operation efficiency first. And then through the lenses of how can we use the new technology to take some of the IT cost out of the equation. And that is simply because even the agencies that spend a lot on IT, tax agencies, not just in the US, but globally, they tend to spend 15%, in some cases 20% of their total OpEx on technology. That's a big chunk of money. But if you're saving 10% of that 20%, it's 2%. If you're using technology to help save 10% of the remaining 80%, it's a bigger cost saving, right? So I always think, how can we use AI and agents to improve operational efficiency? Having said that, particularly with Gen AI and AI agents, the variety of deployment models, the opportunity to use different AI models, different LLMs for different purposes, or different small language models for different purposes, yes, definitely. Potentially is a wild west of costs that may pop up here and there, right? So the FinOps equation is even more important in the context of AI.
Well, Max, it seems like we've really got to take a comprehensive look. We've got to bring all of our folks to the table, have a long range perspective, and stay tuned to all of the new technologies that are presenting themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. As one of my managers always says, you got to have your hands in the now and the eyes on the future, and that's not always easy. But you go with the flow, and you always keep in mind the opportunities and risks of what you're doing, and avoid just to embrace the hype as much as you can.
Well, that's great advice. And it also seems like a great place to wrap up our conversation. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. Max Claps, the Research Director for IDC's Government Insights.
Great to speak with you, Terry.
I'm Federal Drive host Terry Gerton, and you're watching the Federal News Network. Now, let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cloud Exchange.